Thank you so much for coming. My name is Chrysa Parkinson, and I'm a professor of dance at Stockholm University of the Arts. I'm a dancer, that's my background, and my perspective is from the point of view of the performer. That's how I navigate and orient. I'm very, very happy to be here in this extraordinary facility with these very particular, sparkling fellows that you have in this institution. Just to say, to contextualize the situation a little bit, the four fellows, PhD candidates-ish, this is a special moment in that it's the first time that the four of them have really come together. They came together on their own initiative. They invited me to speak with them and listen to to where they are in their work yesterday. So we spent about 8 hours together just going through their work. So what we're going to do today is briefly, each of the artists, researchers will introduce themselves and what they're working on, and then I will bring up 4 topics that are sort of gleaned from what happened yesterday to speak through, and at the end we'll open to questions. There's a lot to do, so, so we can begin.
Hello, good morning, or good soon afternoon, let's see. My name is Brynjar Åbel Bandlien, and I'm a dancer. And I'm a research fellow here since a year and a half. Yes, and if I'm to introduce myself shortly, to not go into my whole background as a dancer, I would say that my background is from here. Actually, I studied at this very school like 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Yeah. And I was training classical ballet, and I worked for a while as a classical dancer. And then I moved into modern dancing at the age of 24. And then, since then, I danced my way into the more contemporary dance field. So I've been, you could say, panning through the entire, like from the most classical to the most experimental in a period of 25 years. So that's shortly how I see myself and how I think of my dancing. I'm doing a project here at the school called Recurrences, and I will read just the first opening lines of my project description for you to get a picture. My project aims to develop a method that I have become aware of over the last 10 years. When a creative work is fully underway, certain situations, events, actions, movements, and I add states, can be recognized as recurrent. I call these events recurrences. Rather than being created or produced, these recurrences manifest, or say, fall out of the dance practice. Once they are crystallized, they can be recognized, understood, and pursued in the continuation of the work, and also be manifest in the final performance. So, I've had a few presentations already of recurrences and giving examples of how they can manifest in what kind of environments. It's often in a group environment, more people working together, often non-hierarchically. So there are certain conditions for these to appear, at least in my experience. But as of now, I'm interested in following the work of another artist, namely Amanda Stegel. Are you here? Yes, there you are. Hello, Amanda. Who is a professor of choreography here at the Academy and who has received a 3-year project called Amphibious Trilogies. So, my role is a little bit of a double role. I'm here as a fellow to research on recurrences, and I'm also a research fellow inside the work of Amanda. So, I am, let's say this is how I'm seeing it. I'm trying to follow Amanda's processes artistically and to see what recurrences might fall out of her practice. So that is where we are at this moment. I can already now, just to make an advertisement, Amanda is presenting her work on Thursday at 10 o'clock in the space below the cantina, in case some of you would like to get a better picture of her work, because I don't have time. I have only 15 minutes now to go into that. But I will also be there and go deeper into my work with Amanda in this relation. So 10 o'clock Thursday, level -2 under the cantina. But that's not an English word, is it?
Cafeteria.
Cafeteria. Thank you. All right. So after, yeah, I can maybe I'll try and demonstrate a little bit of what I've done, just so it doesn't get too dry. I feel like my theory is often experienced better when I also give some examples. So I'm gonna see if this works. Okay. I'm going to try and do something for you. Can you see me as well?
Yeah.
Not really. Okay. I'm not done.
5 minutes, Brynjar.
5 more minutes? Okay.
Oh, that's...
I'll do one more. All right, so what was this all about? So what I've been working on in the last, while waiting for recurrences to appear in the works of Amanda, I have initiated a series of attempts to find recurrences in other places. Like for the last 2 years, I have been posting videos from YouTube and elsewhere on my Facebook profile that I find mesmerizing. And they are kind of hypnotic in one way or another. And I've invited 4 dancer researchers. One of them I see here, Ann-Kristin Berg-Kongsnes, Marte Reithaug-Sterud. Yes, it's, help me out. And it's Magnus Myhr and, what did you say? Yeah, Magnus Myhr, and I will come up. I'm sorry, I'm a bit slow this morning. But,
Rosa.
See the
Rosa.
Ah, yes, of course. And Rosa Mustari, thank you. And they are all looking into these different videos that I've posted and try to discern from them what is mesmerizing about them, and also trying to see if they can translate what they find mesmerizing into a kind of translation, like an instant translation from the video into a little dance. Yeah. So I've been working with them for like just a couple of weeks, but that's what we're doing, and we're presenting this work at the Henny Onsdag Kunstcenter on the 7th of April. And I invite you all to come to see what it's not going to be a dance performance, but it's going to be a sharing of this practice, just like I now shared a bit of the practice of mesmerizing with you. Yeah. How am I doing for time? Huh?
It's a good time to end.
Okay, cool. So, to finish off, I say in a year's time, I will try to make a kind of critical reflection around the whole work about recurrences, together with Frank Bock, who is a dancer, but also a psychologist or psychoanalytic.
Psychologist.
Yeah.
Existential psychologist.
Yes, and we're going to have some dialogues that we hope to make into some kind of metalogue. So I'm not just talking to you, but I'm also doing what I'm saying in that kind of way, in a dialogue with Frank. So that's in about a year's time, maybe when we know a little more about the work of Amanda, the recurrences per se, and mesmerizing. Thank you.
Thank you, Brynjar.
Yep. Skal du gå? Okay. Yes. So, my name is Janne-Camilla Lyster. I will do a kind of PowerPoint thing here, but bear with me. So, this is the title of my project. This will be a really short presentation, as you know. But just to briefly include you into what I'm very engaged in my project. So it's called Choreographic Poetry, Creating Literary Scores for Dance. I am a dancer. I have my education from here, amongst other places. I also work as a choreographer, and I am a writer or an author. And until recently, actually maybe until just before starting with this PhD, I kept my dancing and my writing very separate, deliberately. But then I came across scores, and this made me dive into the intersection between my practices of writing poetry and of dancing and choreographing. So what is a score? What we normally think of, maybe, like in society, when talking about the score, is this kind of sheet music, you know, with the 5 lines and the notes, and a musician can play it. So that's kind of a traditional form of a score, and a traditional notation form. But to categorize a little, we can say that there are 2 main types of scores. It's the conserving ones, which here I have drawn the world going into the score. So this is to preserve something that already exists in a way. So the traditional music notation that I just mentioned would go into this category, to save it for later, save it for someone else who can then play it exactly as it was. Then this is actually an example from dance. We see the traditional music notation up there, and then it's an equal, we can say, in dance. You can read this as dance, or it's written dance. It's from the Baroque era. It's called Bouchon-Feuillet notation. And we see back here, I could go into this in details, but just like briefly now. We have the man and the woman seen from above. So the one to the right is the woman because of the ball gown. And then we see the feet, how the feet move. And all the signs, it's really beautifully written, this notation. All the signs say something about what the feet are doing. And then, unfortunately, it's not preserved so much what the arms are doing. It says somewhere that if you are in trouble with your arms, you can ask your dance master. And yeah, so more about this another time. Then it's the other category, which I call a generating score. And here you see the world coming out of the score. And this is the type that I'm investigating in my project. So most of my work, or the tradition I am rooted in, is the open form tradition from the 1950s, the New York school with Cunningham, Cage, Earl Brown, all of these artists, both from music, dance, and visual arts. Where they started to experiment with notation. What if I do this? What can happen then if a musician plays it or if a dancer dances it? So I have some examples here. This is a very early one, 1952. It's Earl Brown. This is a graphic score. It's we can say you could pretty much read it as symbols, as there are certain things that are reading or repeating, and you can kind of read the differences between the certain symbols here. So this is a graphic score. This is another one. It's the British composer Cornelius Cardew. He was also an excellent visual artist, or a designer, graphic designer. So this is meant to be music. And what's really intriguing about these kinds of scores is that it doesn't give the answer to how it can sound or how it can be danced. But still, there are some things that are really, really specific, I would say. I would argue that you could read so much specificity out from this score, even though it doesn't say, do this. So it opens certain kinds of doors and it closes other ones, and this I find really interesting. This is a third example. It's Stockhausen. Maybe people interested in music know about him. One of the great composers within this field. Here you can see there's some connotations to this traditional music notation still with the lines, but then something else is happening. And it goes into what I would call a pictorial score, so more to do with visual art, that you can read it as you would read an image in a museum, for instance, or a painting. Here is another. This is from a book called Notations 21. It's in the library, and I, of course, recommend everybody to have a look at it. It is a marvelous collection of lots of different scores, so it can really get your imagination going and like give lots of examples of what an open score can be. This is an early text score. We can say there are two types of text scores, like mainly, and it's instructional and allusive. Instructional is like, go there, do this. Allusive is have a more maybe poetical quality often. So this is the whole score. It reads, most of them were very old grasshoppers, and it's a piano piece. So this is kind of my way into what I'm doing, this kind of score. So what I'm doing, I'm specializing on is literary scores for dance, and within that even poetic, a poetic text type. So I call it choreographic poetry. I write so that the poetry follows the dancer. So here is one line is the dancer and the other one is the score. I've explored this in many ways. It doesn't have to be like real, or the time that you read the score doesn't have to be the time you do it. Sometimes syntheses and expansions occur and something take longer to dance than to say, for instance. But there are I'm writing this underside all the time to the dance. So it's not just one point and anything can depart from that, but it's going like this all the way through. So the written score is the dance. So I write it as dance. So I'm committed to dance when I write, and the dance is committed to the score. And this is kind of like playing a game, I guess. You have to follow the rules to have fun in the game. The opposite maybe would be kind of thinking inspiration, that I can take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But I'm specializing in this way of really committing to the score, and the other way around. Yes, so the score is written and composed to be transformed into dance, and that also means I don't know how it looks until I see someone dance it. So I always work with this kind of blind side. But that doesn't mean I don't have to be really, really specific. And there are some things to do with time and space and movement that I still can know something about in the writing of how it is conveyed to the dancer. So time, space, and movement, I categorize these into 5 different subcategories, like given time, indicated time, embedded, found, and experienced time. I don't think I have time now to go deeply into each, but I can say that, like, an example of given time, which is the most strict one, is I say this is 2 minutes. This text is 2 minutes, and then I have given you kind of the clock time of it. Then it would be subdivisions within that, but still it's very like strict. On the other end here we have experience time, and this is what I have been like more and more interested in. If I do this with the text or that, or I change this word, or I change the text like this, or the setup like this, or the format, what happens to the experience of time in the reader, the dancer, and the experienced space, the experience of movement. So there is my point of interest at the moment. So this is just a brief exemplification of what I'm concerned with, like singular word, how words are put together, what they create together as a synthesis, phrasing, like rhythm, melodic, and tempus, like present, past tense, future, or addressal, how to speak. Is it like a soft imperative saying you do this, or is it without any pronouns, like he, she, it, you, I. Text topography, so how it is put on the page in relation to the rest of the text. Paper and score format, so it's very different to have a score that you have to read like a book, or a one that you can fold out, for instance, or a one that is like a trekkspill, so you can fold it out like this or like this. All of these things inform or affect the reader, the performer. And tactility also, I'm looking a little bit into. So paper types. I think I was through there, actually, yeah. So, a crash introduction to my course. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Ingri Fiksdal, and I work as a choreographer based here in Oslo. I have been part of the Norwegian Artistic Research Program since 2013, and I'm now in the final stages, and my final presentation is going to be on the 7th of November this year. My research project is called Choreography as Collective and Affective Event, and it explores how choreographic structures and strategies can produce the potential for new experiences, thoughts, and ideas to occur amongst the audience. This aim is founded in a belief in art as a motor for change, through taking the role as utterly useless in a society where most other things have a given or known purpose. When confronted with something that doesn't perform as expected, or something that resists classification, we have to look for new approaches, and in these moments of liminality, there's potential for the unpredictable or unforeseen to occur. So it's a little introduction to what I'm looking for within choreography. My research question is, how can particular choreographic methods make the performances produced in my research effective? And to be clear, my main concern here is the experience of the audience and how the various performances work on the audience. And I'm going to come back to this notion of effect later. I have so far created and toured 5 different performances as part of this research period, and I apply a number of methodical approaches in order to explore the research question. However, there are some common traits to the choreographic structures, strategies, and tactics employed. To mention a few, the performers are often masked. This has to do in a belief in kinesthetic transference. So this idea that you can sit as an audience member and look at what's happening in front of you and experience the movement through your own body. And my personal approach to this is that this is easier for me to get at as an audience member if I do not see the faces of the performer and have to also deal with how that particular performer is dealing with how they approach the movement material and how they relate to the audience. So there can be some sort of more clear focus on the body and the movement in itself, let's say. Another common trait to my pieces is that the performers' bodies are often extended through costume-like objects or scenography. This connects to the next point, and that's that the choreography is all-encompassing, so it includes all elements of the piece. I'm as concerned with the movement of light, movement of the sound in space, as much as the movement of the performers, etc. And an example of this, a recent example of this, is a piece called Diorama, which was produced last year in collaboration with Fredrik Floen, who's there. And in this piece is performed outdoors by the sea. And then I also see the choreography as something that has to work with the change of temperature, how the tide rises, the weather of the given time, and that all these things become part of the piece. So, of course, I cannot choreograph these, but there's an approach to choreography where I make room for these different elements, or attempt to make room for them. Another point, which is common to my work, is that I work with extended time, so relatively slow development of few elements within each project. And I'm now at the stage in my process where I work on summarizing and disseminating my reflections. And I think of reflection work as ongoing and inherent to artistic practice. However, I still find it challenging to figure out the format of dissemination that makes sense and which I can feel can convey the work that's been done. And as affect is a central theme in my research, I've been looking at various strands of affect theory, as well as defining what I myself think of or experience as affect. And a central lineage here is that of the Canadian Brian Massumi, who's a political philosopher, and he follows in the footsteps of Spinoza and Deleuze. And he gives the following definition of affect. Affect is an ability to affect and be affected. It is a pre-personal intensity corresponding to the passage from one experiential state of the body to another, and implying an augmentation or diminution in that body's capacity to act. So with Massumi, compared to feelings and emotions, which are seen as respectively personal and social, affects are more abstract, as they are prior to or outside of human consciousness, and this means they cannot be fully realized through language. So, with Brian Massumi, feelings, they are personal, and they have to do with the individual, and also the individual, how the individual recognizes this feeling that you know that you are sad because you've been sad previously, let's say. Or emotions that are dealing with a particular social context, so you know that the feeling of a funeral is sadness often. So, and this is very different to affect then. However, there's another main strand within affect theory, and this stems from psychologist Sylvan Tompkins. And his psychobiology also sees affect as hardwired, but still something which is under the influence of social relations. And the feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed, she takes this even further when she points out that affects are influenced, for instance, by social, cultural norms and prejudice. So an example she uses is that if you walk through a neighborhood that is known to be dangerous, there's a good chance that you will feel scared. And this is not hardwired, in her opinion, and it's not prior to language. It just stems from already acquired knowledge. So Ahmed's concern is to figure out how affects are politicized and inscribed in particular cultural contexts. But then I'd just like to point out that what Ahmed here calls affect would be feelings with Massumi. So I presented this in a seminar in October, and I was challenged to try to make my own definition. People were saying, why are you leaning so much on these theories? What is affect for you? And here's an attempt. I think for me, affect would be that which arises in a meeting with something that I'm not able to place or categorize, but which creates for me a new thought, idea, or feeling. And these should be thoughts, ideas, or feelings that I cannot place in relation to the knowledge and experience that I already have. And then I would like to add that in the meeting with this given something, it also produces a certain slightly altered, like higher state within me. Then back to how to try to apply this to the dissemination of the reflection work. And I was rereading Henk Borgdorf's The Conflict of the Faculties, and I came across his idea of unfinished thinking. I'm just going to read a quote from that. Artistic research seeks not so much to produce, but rather to provide a specific articulation of the pre-reflective, non-conceptual content of art. It thereby invites unfinished thinking. Hence, it is not formal knowledge that's the subject matter of artistic research, but thinking in, through, and with art. Art thereby invites reflection, yet it eludes any defining thought regarding its content. Artistic research is the acceptance of that paradoxical invitation. And I think this is a little bit of the paradox where I'm at now. I'm thinking, how can I reflect upon my artistic work in a way that makes sense? And I thought maybe it's worth looking at the word sense in this respect, because it denotes both the human sensorium of sight, smell, kinesthetic sense, etc., as well as perception through the intellect, so a sense of security to make sense, etc. My question is then, how can I disseminate my reflections in a way where these aspects are conveyed? So this is the work I need to be doing now, basically. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. So I'm Mette Edvardsen. I started the fellowship in October 2016, so same as Brynjar, and that means that I'm supposed to end around September or autumn of 2019. The title of my research, which was is writings in time and space, which is something that I somehow kept deliberately open at the moment of kind of proposing the project, because of also acknowledging, I guess, or trusting the process of the work, which is in focus for me, and to also be able to that's something that is subject to change. More precisely, now I could maybe say everything all the time at the same time, and that's more representative to what it feels like. But this is also because I have set up my research in such a way that I think of the 3 years as a kind of well, it's a duration, but it's also a space, a time space, and inside of this, there's different things that are taking place. So it's not that I start with a question and then I have this method and I do these things, I conduct this research, and then in the end there's a conclusion, but that throughout this, within this space, there's many things that are happening, and the kind of outcome, let's say, is then cumulative moments in this duration. Yeah, and then, well, maybe also to say that, so coming from dance, working in performance, still kind of situating my work within dance, even if one might say that there's not so much dancing in the work, at times at least, there's something of whatever other medias or other formats that I use. For me, this is always in relation to the performing arts as a situation, but also as a practice. So when I'm writing, it's for me it's clear that this is within the field of performance, and I'm interested in this from the perspective of choreography, not with an ambition on the writing as such. So the reason why this is a little bit in focus for me right now was maybe not so articulate to start with, but still kind of connecting to the choice of why to set up the research like this. And I guess one of the main things that I think that this context can provide, and which was the reason why I was also very interested in it, is that it offers another space and a possibility to look at the practice as a total practice and acknowledging the different aspects of it. So we can consider that the work that we do is not only the pieces that we produce. I guess that's not specific to me. I think there's maybe something more general about that, but to really consider that and to think, if all these elements are up there on the same plane or horizon, together, not that they are necessarily the same, but to kind of give them this, time which equals then value, and to see what does that then produce. So another way to say, like, to make the invisible visible, and then to open that process or sharing also for others. So what does that mean? What is the difference in the research that I'm doing in my work anyhow, and then when I'm inside of this kind of context? But of course there are things that are being made or also produced. Rather than saying that I will come with a conclusion, it doesn't mean that there are not any endpoints, but maybe that you can consider there's several of them. And in this planning of the 3 years, to name that I will produce 2 pieces. Oslo was the first one, which I made in March, so the spring of the first year. And then there's also, next to performances, so the regular format where the work exists outside of my own sphere. And then there's also other formats of presentations, conversations, work sessions, other things that are also being set up or articulated in different ways throughout the research. I have taken some notes here. Yeah, so something like more specific maybe to my work is that thinking of choreography as writing, which doesn't mean that it has to be language, but maybe that it's to propose it as something else than visual. So that considering that the dance is not only a visual art form, but there's also other senses that are involved, listening, sensing, feeling, and to something that is also coming back in a lot in my work is this interest in this total space. So there's, however it might be this kind of setup with the audience and the stage, and something is taking place here and you are paying attention to what's taking place, but to also consider this as a total space. So what are the different agents involved? What are the different things that are at stake, and how to work with that? So imagination is, I would, I formulate something around language, and at the same time it's not really being interested in language as such, but not in semiotics, or not. It's like to say I'm not considering myself as a writer. However, what if I bring language, and before that it was objects, it can also be different things, but now the interest is there. What does that offer me in my practice to access things that I'm interested to do? So in working with imagination, of course, there's the capacity of language. There's been many points there that has offered many other things, like to say that language is not only to produce discourse, but it can also be considered as material. So and in this sense, also, like Ingrid was saying, this relation between reflection and the practice, they are not so easy to separate. In some sense, you could say, well, I make things up. That's my art, that's what I'm doing, and how do I reflect upon it, how do I justify it, how do I prove it, how do I, what is true, or how do I refer to things, how do I put this kind of other context around it? And in some sense you can say the artwork, well, ideally speaks for itself, but of course that doesn't mean that there's not other things to articulate, and certainly the reflection is already within making the artwork. So for me, the research is not an invitation to explain my art or to, unravel the mysteries behind it, but more a way to, for me, also to go inside of it, articulate, and try to also let these other parts of the work be exist on equal terms. Yeah. Another thing that for me has been important in this context in my work is also to think that, well, we don't exist in isolation. So I don't see the separation, like if I think the practice and the reflection is entangled, but also the outside and the inside, so but the communication between the two. So in the context of the school, of course, doesn't mean that everything is interesting to share, that's clear, but or all parts of processes can be shared, but what is the relationship between and of course certainly in performing arts the presence of an audience is very important. Other art forms also communicate with the outside view, of course. But how can these worlds meet? So for me, this has been another point to connect let's say, the venue outside, so a theater venue, and the institution of the school, and to see what relationship there is between the two, and how can these be sometimes interchanged, or what can be the dialogue?
5.
Yes, but maybe that's okay to. Yeah, maybe the last thing is that what I feel this context has maybe given more of an awareness about is also to acknowledge. So where do you place yourself in a wider context, but maybe also to acknowledge what is my history, what is my context, and how is that important to me. And something that I think is, at least speaking from the performing arts practice, it's not something that's very valued. The feeling of, disclosing your references, more kind of diminishing the art, whereas one could maybe look at this as a positive, as an extra that is comparing to literature, for example, where there is much more practice of writing about each other or sharing about each other's work. So there's an interest there too, and I feel an opportunity offered by this context to really bring these things up and to give that time equal value as well. I will stop here, I think.
Okay. Thank you. So now what we'll do is speak through 4 different topics that came up yesterday, that we touched on, that are sort of embedded in the work of these artists. And then at the end, after that, we'll open to questions from you. So I'll just read through the topics and we'll try to address them one by one and keep track of them. The first was to speak about kinesthetic transference, particularly in relation to scale and skill. The second was to speak about translation transformation in relation to imagination, medium change, and mediums that translate. So mediums that going from one medium to another, and what mediums allow that to happen, media allow that to happen. Third possible topic, it was time. It's like really big, but particularly in relation to current and currency, also past reflection and future projection as parts of artistic practice. Fourth was to speak about the relation of theory to practice in usefulness and pleasure in these artists' current work. So first, Ingri, you speak directly about kinesthetic transference as being a value and desire in your in what you present. There's always the question of how you know what happened there. Like how can you be sure that something did get transferred? Or so I would be interested to hear. You spoke about it yesterday a little bit about the methods that you use to determine whether that's happening. Okay. So kinesthesia is the perception of motion through the body. Is that a happy? Yes? Okay. In your own body, right?
It's one of the first things to develop, actually, relationship.
Yeah. Thank you, Olive. And the transference of that happens through touch, possibly through visual media, but also through empathy. In fact, often you experience the perception of another's motion through empathizing with that motion. That's a possibility, or through touch. Is that ça va?
I think the first time I became interested in this was when working on a project called Band in 2013. And the idea behind Band was to create a concert-like situation amongst the audience, but without using any sound on stage. So with the sound removed, then we were thinking how can the movement replace the sound somehow in terms of producing a concert-like affect. What we experienced then is that if we worked on quite sort of repetitive, loopy movement for a longer period of time, there seems to be, not with everyone, but with a lot of people in the audience, they start to experience this pulse in your own body. So you have this thing going on amongst the people watching. So that was kind of the first approach. And then I worked with this in a variety of ways, where the goal, let's say, has been to create some kind of hypnosis-like, or to produce altered states amongst the audience. Yeah.
And there's a question of proximity and staging proximity.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think proximity is one thing. I feel that it's easier to experience this when you are relatively close to what's happening than if you're on the 20th row, let's say. Another thing that for me is important is that the movement is close to, not gesture as such, but more common daily-like movement. I think for there to be a resonance, it has to be close to something that the spectator is likely to have done themselves, such as jumping, for instance. And I think if the movement becomes, or the movement vocabulary becomes too removed from ordinary daily movements, then it's much harder to experience this transference in your own body.
It's maybe an interesting link to Brynjar, and because often you're dealing with images that are non-human, and the scale is very small, and so just to hear a little bit about how you consider that.
Now you're referring to the mesmerizing bit.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. In the work with the mesmerizing, which I have to say we just began, so it's quite early stages. It's a bit risky of me to share it so early, but I'm also experimenting with it as every opportunity I get. the feeling from creating, like you have an image or a movement that is alluring to you in some way visually, or it drags you in, like it's mesmerizing. Yeah, that is the experience of the image. But how do one translates, I mean, that into your own body and into yourself as a movement? That's one of the things we are questioning and wondering about. And the second is how do you transfer that from you to the viewer? So it's like there are two translations, you could say, going on a kinesthetic level as well as I think also affective, because it's like if the kinesthetic notion is physical, there is also a lot of affect, like you said, empathy. It's like has a lot of this emotional relation, like you create a lot of identification with what you see, or it's strange to you, but it allures you somehow. So that I think it's also a little bit about, for these things that you're talking about to happen, both to me and to the viewer, one has to somehow be willing to, or one has to be allowing oneself to be sensitive to that part of the movement, or the experience of the dance. Yeah. So it's not just that it's going to catch you anyway. It's also a willingness, I would say. Like I would have to want to let myself be mesmerized in order to become mesmerized. It's not someone, you cannot just choose that from someone else. Yeah. So that, I think it's an awareness, it's a sensitivity, it's also a choice, like you chosen to go into that bit of your work. And I remember seeing an early staging of band at Splice, in fact, where you were really trying it out, and there were a lot of comments afterwards, like, why are you having your arms bound by your body? Why don't you use your arms? And I was thinking, well, if someone so deliberately chooses not to use their arms, don't you think that that's a choice, and they really want you to focus on something else? Maybe it's the body, the trunk of the body that does contain a lot of affect. We read one another instantly. When you meet another person, you can tell how that person is feeling or doing just by how they're holding the trunk of their body. So you know, it's a choice to focus on this, and I think if one is giving space to this, and in life, but especially in art, that one can actually communicate a lot through just presence and yeah, through these abilities, I would say, of the body.
It's interesting what you say about if this movement that's restricted in some way, and then the call to participate kinesthetically in that movement. That you might not, there's a sort of effort and willfulness on the part of the watcher to enter into shared sensation there with something that they might not be familiar with or necessarily have wanted to see. You know, I think there's an interesting demand on the receiver of the call to kinesthetic transference, which also reminds me of this relation that you mentioned in between the score and the reader. That the score doesn't tell you what to do unless you want to be told. You know, or there's
for sure. Yeah. The scores I write, they kind of have as a premise that the reader is willing to establish a sensorial relationship to the score. So you have to invest in order to get. But then there's also the questions of immediacy, like what speaks to you like in short term, and what can be discovered through practice. So these are also aspects that I take into consideration when researching with people and when finishing the scores. There are different times for different addressals, you could say, in the scores also.
And Mette, with your work, I know that you have this background of study in Feldenkrais, which has a very specific relation to giving direction and sort of calling experience from the listener. And I wonder if there's anything in that in relation to your use of voice and.
I think that, I mean, certainly this is informing a lot of, or the way of thinking and approaching, but I think that was somehow what I said also with this idea of what is the visual. So if you relate to also what Ingrid speaks about effect, but also what, if I connect this also to imagination or the sensing. So the listening, I mean, then on language, the difference of listening to the voice speaking or reading something or hearing it being sung, the different kinds of medias for language, but also what space that opens in imagination, and with what is it that we are creating something. So is language only there to inform and tell and describe, or can it also be there as evoking something, and then what is it that takes place? So if imagination is only to see what is not there, that could be something. So imagine there's an elephant there. Or can also that be a process of opening up other things, which is maybe not defined from me, or it might also be different for all of us. Yeah, and I think that this is... then there's different qualities. I mean, the sensorial, the kind of the sensing in the space, the presence. There can be different aspects that builds towards this. And I think for in relation to that practice with the Feldenkrais and the body, I mean, that's one of the things that I find extremely interesting in this work is the relationship to language specifically, where it's. I mean, there's. Just to say briefly, there's two ways to practice this work. One is hands-on, so there's a practitioner who's working with someone, so with manipulating or moving parts of the body. Or you could also do, based on the same method, you could, through oral, how to say, not description, but speaking, so orally speaking through a lesson or a sequence of exercises, and you can obtain the same thing. So there's something of how the physical in relation to the capacity of the human mind to imagine might do exactly or achieve the same things even when the actual movement hasn't been done. So there's really something there that's, I mean, maybe a bigger.
Well, we're sort of moving into the translation, transformation, imagination area of consideration.
I mean, just to say, in terms of body practice, this is a very, when you're training and there's no limit to improvement. The only thing is to train, and you do more and more, and you learn different things in order to. So the relation to this, and then the understanding of that, you could achieve something by the same, let's say, by going through that in the imagination and not doing, and to actually see how the nervous system is connecting to this imagination. It's not just I imagine something and something happens, it's specific, but to see that there are these deeper structures that are able to make
manifest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a teacher who was also, well, I worked with her as a dancer, this woman Irene Haltman, and she taught me to visualize movement after having worked on it during the day, rehearsal during the day, and then go home and feel it and as a process of learning and refining the material. It was very, very effective. The only thing for me is that I got slow. It made me, I often ended up in a different tempo. I couldn't feel tempo. I could just feel shape and texture somehow. Detail. I know that Brynjar, you had some questions around specific questions around translation that you were interested in engaging Jana Camilla with, I think.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit to what I mentioned earlier. Also, this perception or ability to, or willingness to let oneself be, like the imaginative part of it can also be seen. But can I start somewhere else? Because I liked your bringing in the elephant in the room. I was like, it's here, and the minute you say it, it's there. And I don't know if this comes, how I get back to the translation bit, but one of the, as you are my supervisor, one of the things you asked me is, what is it, Brynjar, that you are dealing with in a way, or you are in your work that is present somehow, but it's in your blind spot, or it's like not in your vision. Yeah, it's in the area of your, it's in your awareness, but you're not grasping it. Yeah. Did you get the same question? Yeah. No, you're nodding.
I'm supervising both Jana Camilla and Brynjar, so they're exposing my repetitions.
And that was, I thought that was such a brilliant question, because it's like, what are your elephants? Where are your? What is it that you are kind of aware of, but you're not handling, you're not dealing with? And I've been thinking about this and thinking I haven't gotten the answer yet, but like at first I thought, for the first year I thought it was the queer element of my work. Where does it come? Because I am definitely thinking in certain ways, like my way into all these topics also is like, I feel like I have a certain coming at it from a certain angle, and it's something about that interests me, but I can't grasp it. And I thought I have to make it part of my works explicitly for it to exist somehow, you know? Like some colleague of mine do, and I am very admiring them. But after a year of thinking about that, I was like, it's so everywhere. It's like I'm inside the elephant, if you like, you know. That's,
oh no!
You know, it's all around me. I can't point it out, but that would be basically trying to say everything. So I dropped that out. Then I thought, maybe it's the visual. Maybe it's the aesthetics. Maybe in this research process, I'm not interested in how things look or how they perform. I'm interested in what they do, like what they do to me and what they do to others. And that, you could say, is, in this translation, is like, what is important? What do you look for? Is it the kinesthetic thing? Is it the, like you're saying, dance is more than an aesthetic? And I would say it's a really big pity if dance becomes reduced to an aesthetic, like it just looks good or virtuoso or funny. I've done a lot of that kind of dancing, and it's fun. But I'm interested in this in this project. I'm really in this research project. I'm interested in what does things do. So it's hard to hard to define, because half of the job is done by the viewer. It's in your work, you know, like you need imagination, you need to be able to perceive it and use, in Norwegian we have a great word for it, is forestillingsevne, because you have to throw your own imagination onto what you see and fill in the gaps. And, you know, so when I'm speaking of translation or of my own perception in the work, I can really only speak from a subjective dancer's point of view in the middle of the stage, with surrounded by all wonderful artists around, and from that point of view try and say something about the moment of the performance. Yeah. So that's where I'm at this moment, at least. And yeah, it relates to kinesthetic, it relates to translation, because I'm not really dealing with choreography. I'm dealing with, like, as a executing dancer, so I'm thinking practice or as a practitioner. So it's a constant, like you constantly interpret and translate and perform. And yeah, I don't know if I said anything about what you asked me, but that was why it came out. Yeah.
Yes, my project is very much about this, I don't call it translation, but transformation for sure, that the score is supposed to be a dance, or it's already a dance, but it has to come alive through the performer. And there's a whole set of methods or approaches that I have developed so far. I think I'll not go into detail to those methods now, but just so for those who are interested, you know that they exist and you can come to me and we can speak about it. But like briefly, it has to do with certain ways into establishing this sensorial relationship, and to access a kind of dancerly imagination, you could say, maybe you can call it that. But I just wanted to say a little thing about imagination, because my project very much depends on imagination. At the same time, I have gotten into trouble with imagination quite a bit, and this becomes problematic, I find, when something I call the riddle appears. So with the riddle, it has to do with maybe if you go into the doing or the practice of the score, wanting to show the score in a way. So you feel a responsibility maybe as a performer to actually convey in a decent way what is written there. And then mime and illustration comes very close then. So what can happen is that you maybe see things around you that the audience can't see, or you try to kind of deal with things that are there, but that the audience can't access, and this kind of feeling of a riddle emerges. That if you know at the same time as this happens that there is a score, and it is not just any score, it's a written text, then I get a bit of problems because then the audience might be very concerned with, okay, but what does this mean? I should have the score now so I could, like, you know, figure it out and read this properly, and the dancer trying to convey it, but I can't, you know, all this problematics. And it's been affecting very much how I approach my writing, to avoid this, especially the sense that you have to kind of say what is there, but through dance, because what I think is really interesting with these open form scores is that they can produce a specific shared moment that is the kind of the where the work comes into life. It's the shared moment with the audience. So it's not about the secret of the score existing somewhere else, or you know, you could read the score before or after the show. It's the performance. It's not about that, but to actually configure or create, vad heter det? Constitute this moment, this shared moment together. So that is one example, and kind of an easy example, just to be clear, is title, the problem of titles, how they can make this riddle happen. I had a score called Tulip, and like when I called it Tulip, I didn't foresee that it would become this problem. But as I sat in the audience and overhearing conversations after, it was all of this like, did you see the tulip? Was that the moment of the tulip? What does it mean, the tulip? And all of these things. And from my side, I wanted the tulip to be more of this, you know, like a sense, an image, something accessible through like the quality of the colors and the, you know, but it didn't work. So I changed the title actually of the score to make it more accepting, in a way, that if you see the dance and you have the title, because the title is often the one word or the sentence that follows the dance concretely. You know, the text is in the score, but the title kind of is imposed onto the dance, so it becomes also a part of the goggles that the audience watches it with or reads it with. So calling it, for instance, anatomy or love or beauty, then you kind of have to accept that what you see is beauty, or what you see is love. You don't have to kind of look for when the moment of love, or maybe it's a bad title, I don't know. But this is the kind of the problematics I'm dealing a little bit with, because it's not a problem in itself, but if it's something that is not intended and it becomes a big aspect of the experience of the dance, then I think it's important for me to learn from it and take it into reconsideration or consideration in the project. So yeah, that was a little bit about imagination and how it is both a friend and a foe, I guess, in these processes of
I think
transformation.
What you say about the shared moment and brings us very clearly to the question of the current. Which I think, were you going to say something?
No, I was going to ask something back, if that's...
Yeah.
I was wondering if that's really a problem of imagination. Because for me, I mean, I understand what is problematic about it, but I'm thinking that the riddle comes in maybe more, or this is a question, like, isn't that perhaps more about what, you know, accessibility and what you think you should or shouldn't be able to access or understand. I mean, and then, you know, understanding, you could say, is a conservative concept in that way, that we want to, you know, clear. And so if I think of that, imagination is then more not only reduced to what I can imagine, but the process of imagination. So if I'm thinking of what language, for example, is offering as a capacity, is not only that I can, you know, say this and that makes that you can imagine something, but it's also what through this writing or this use of language, there is a process that is also being evoked, or hopefully a space that opens, or you know, what about the practice of imagination in the sense of, you know, practicing the capacity to imagine something that we don't know. So it's not enough to just fill in the gap somehow. Yeah. And then I think in relation to language, something that I have been discovering a bit is the, you know, if you think in literature, the moments where the descriptions are very well written, extremely detailed, giving a lot of that, it's so much that you really feel, you know, you can see exactly that thing that's being described. So you can say that the capacity of language to be so precise and make us access something. On the other hand, in the performances, of course, that's also another medium. We are in the performance, which is this space of, you know, it's enough to just be in the space and you start to imagine something already. But the being more general and using, saying, you know, table, chair, and being extremely non-specific about it has 4 legs and it has this shelf, it's wood, it's old, it has marks, and that understanding that the capacity to imagine actually is how to say, enhanced or offers something. So there's something in the process of this that I'm wondering if it's really a question of imagination.
Yeah, I think, of course, what you're saying is very interesting, and but I think we have to be aware of the habits of imagination, and that was kind of my concern with this, that we have some ways of seeing or experiencing that we are kind of trained in, and if they come into play in a way that you didn't foresee, or that you maybe didn't want or wasn't searching for, then you have to kind of take that into consideration. So it was this kind of
The thing that it touches on for me is like I said, the question of what time a riddle brings us into. So if I'm looking at something, trying to imagine the solution for it, I'm not here.
Exactly.
I'm projecting to the solution. So like, okay, well that must have been, or this should be, or and so the situating imagination in shared time and shared place is another effort, I think. Just
yeah, when you say this being present, like how do you create, like with dance and theater, you can really create sense of time, like you can expand it, you can shorten it, you can make it feel, in different qualities of time. I would not even speak of time, I would speak of temporality, like it has this, you can mold it almost. And I mean, we're researching, so it's not like about producing time, or we're testing it, tasting it, or finding different ways of working with it. And now that you say of being present, like what a riddle makes you be in the future, or I am going to solve this puzzle, just wait. But other what brings us here or together. And if I can remind, we were doing this exactly a year ago. There was meeting for the fellows of our year, at least, up in one of the conference rooms here. And I've been dancing a lot in conference spaces since I've been in this program. It seems to become one of my recurrences. And we were doing these short presentations up in this conference room. And I decided to do a little dance even then, even though we had almost no time. And in that dance, there was like a lot of erratic movement and so on. And all of a sudden, I stopped. And right then, Mette mentioned to me afterwards, like, when you did that, everybody was in the space all of a sudden. From being everywhere, from having coffee on their minds, being like on their way, still somewhere, I forgot my phone. All of a sudden, everybody was together. And I remember I was busy with how long can I hold this silence? What can I do with it? What does it do? In this context, it's strange, blah, blah, blah. But then afterwards you told me that was the first time this whole day we were actually in this space together. And I thought, wow, that blew my mind. I was like, wow, that's more powerful than I had thought it would be. But yeah. So it's like how one can train one's sensitivity to these things, how one can build it, make it last longer.
And also that's a value for you, that sense of currency.
I think there are two values. Like I feel like to be able to affect the experience of time or temporality isn't a value. It's a skill or a craft. And I think being together, which is one of my favorite things about dance and theater and performance, is that it brings people in a room together. So two values then, for me.
Sorry, Mette.
No, it was just like there's something in that I've been thinking about a lot, is that how in performing arts there's kind of like a fetish of the moments, like the moment and the we've had this conversation also years ago about like there's kind of like a paradox. We're so concerned about the moment and we spend so much time preparing for it. At the same time, I have a sense of that the moment doesn't exist. There's and in these moments, like the thing of watching Brynjar dancing, and the moment he stops, the silence and the kind of there's an impact that's being created, and the awareness of the situation, which gives this feeling. But the moment as such, and I think in acknowledging this for myself in writing, making, performance it's kind of opening, because what space is offered for the audience? Are you there to fulfill the needs or the desires of the artwork so that it can exist, or is there something that's being offered as a space for the audience? And when I say the moment doesn't exist, I think that there's also this taking into account exactly these presences in the plural sense, and the relation to the past and the future, and what's
present, multiple presents.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Well.
So if it doesn't exist, that means you build them and then. Or they. I mean, this exists. We're here.
We're here now.
No, I think it more in the sense of not, the kind of. Or it exists, but it's not a pure thing. Of course, when you, as a performer, you do work with a kind of a pure sense of presence in some respect, in how you're practicing and doing, and the moment of performing. So there's a heightened sense of presence, but it's also. It's also a construction, and it's also more complex than that, and there's many layers.
I would like to just touch on this kind of the temporal drag or lag, or the many times that you're engaged in at once as an artist, considering the artwork and making it, documenting it, or reflecting on it, projecting it, like all of these sort of spiky temporalities that are occurring. Yesterday we spoke about the problem of sort of running towards the point where you reflect back on what you've done. It's kind of like momentous activity and hurry up and get there so you can look back or something.
Well, this came up a bit yesterday, this thought of, especially in relation to reflection, as if it's, of course, comes up as a different question. This is true in artistic research, but it's not a kind of, something that before artistic research there was no reflection. Now that we're here, we have to think, like, come up with something, but to somehow also, the difference of, I mean, there's more to it than that, obviously, but also what this thing of looking back, reflecting back upon something that has been done, and then the ideas of thinking, but what is the reflection that's, the reflection, as I think most of us are also agreeing on, is taking place in the moment. You cannot not be reflecting when you're making a work, but how to also access that and find a language for that or ways to capture that, which is a different kind than the one when you are reflecting back and you already made some decisions and there's another articulation that has taken place. And at least speaking for myself, I think that part of the reflection is also interesting to try and, like get hold of, or which maybe in a different kind of effort inside of this context than before, when it kind of also remains in the more, your own sphere or with your close environment of people that you're collaborating with.
The responsibility that you have to be transparent and communicate is different in a research context.
And then I think there's different choices on that. You could also, reflect back. I mean, and you should also reflect back, I think. But
I felt the necessity to do that. In order to begin the research on recurrences, I had to look upon what had recurrences been to me up until this point, so that I could map out the lay of the land. Where does this come from? What field is it interested in? Is it interesting to look upon these things, and so on? And I'm kind of also attempting to do something similar with Amanda's work, to look for her recurrences, let's say, before coming here, so that to look backwards in order to know where to go forward. But I'm kind of curious about you, Ingrid, like you've done a consistent kind of attempts with your research in these works, and now like 5 years almost passed. So I'm wondering at this point, except the forward, like you have to write your final paper and stuff, I'm just the feel of it, or like now that you are here and you have all that work behind you and following your research through those things, I'm really curious about, like, maybe not what you know or what did it tell you, but how does that feel? Like, what does it, where does it bring you, this work, Like, I'm thinking in the...
No, I think this is something that came up in a discussion with other fellows in another meeting, and there's this idea of time progressing and work should be progressing. So you should be getting somewhere, you should be building on the previous work, and you should learn, you should acquire more and more knowledge. But then I think what's happened to several of us is that this is something that you do for sure, but then at the same time maybe you are moving a little bit in circles as well. So I think probably in many fields of experimental research this happens, but it's not linear. I don't find it to be linear, really. And of course there is, as mentioned, reflection always inherent to research, and I think in all different processes of research. But it's a matter of like finding a format where these can be conveyed, because there are maybe not reflections that are not fully articulated in words, for instance, and that happened in various stages of your work. And I guess this summarizing moment, it is really what is separating artistic research from general artwork that also contains research, but that is framed within these institutions, and there is an expectation for a particular result. So, yeah.
The summarizing moment. That's what you said. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean,
this is the sum. This is the accumulation. This is the.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's a lot more to say, but maybe it would be a good moment to open for questions from people. Yeah. So, I mean, you can. Any questions that you have along the way of these 2 hours, or anything that comes from other situations that you're in?
Do we have
might be relevant here? Would be most welcome.
Trond.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, thanks for a very interesting discussion. One thing that I wanted to comment on is that I think we shouldn't limit ourselves to thinking that reflection is something that is always looking back. Because I think whenever we are in the process of making something, I think we're constantly reflecting. And the purpose of all of that is reflection is really trying to find strategies for what to do next. It's a reflection that is looking forward. And also I think, if you look back at artists that has been writing as artists, I can come up with many examples of artists that are reflecting in very speculative ways. One example is the conductor and composer Busoni, who was writing a sketch for a new aesthetic of music, which was like a completely radical document when it came. The Credo by John Cage is another speculation about the kind of music that simply did not exist when he was writing it. You have all of the manifestos of the Italian futurists, which are also reflecting by speculating about kinds of art forms that doesn't exist yet. So I think reflection can work forward just as well as backwards, and maybe it's looking forward, it really is becoming an important tool for us.
Yeah. Can I comment on that? I think that, or maybe this was missed, but I think that when this idea of reflecting back or summarizing, this idea came up, I think that that can be one aspect, and I think that what I try to say is that what we could detect is that there's different moments, and it's different kinds of reflections that you can make in different moments of the work. The reflections you're making upon the moment of being in front of it, as it were, projecting upon it, having questions. These kinds of the approaching reflections are very different than the ones that you do after you have experienced the work and performed it maybe many times, and you have learn something else. And of course, in what happens a lot is that what stays as writing, at least in performing arts, is a lot. I would dare to say that that's mainly from that point of view, and maybe not even only artists themselves writing, but also other writing upon the work, which is very interesting, but also very different. So I think that that's nice to bring this in this, the future as well, not only the present, what am I doing now, what are the choices I'm making, but to also emphasize the relation of the future. What I find interesting as an adding to that of the reflection is that if we say the works, there's also in making a work, there's also aspects or reflections or thoughts or material that belongs to that process but doesn't maybe make it into the work. There's a moment that the work also starts to speak back and ask for its own place, and then there's things, and some of these things, they just like the sea, they end up at the bottom, and then that's okay. And then there's other things that might also remain in these currents and might be interesting, and they don't have to become new products, other products, but are given then an opportunity or a place to exist as just that. Yeah.
So I think also it's interesting to point out that we're talking a bit about like reflecting, writing, blah 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 blah, but that in this program, reflection can be documented in any medium or in any form, that you're just kind of limited by your own imagination and by what is of course relevant to your project, but is for those who are maybe curious about the program and do I have to write a thesis? You maybe know already, but you don't, you know, the reflection can be documented in so many ways, and that also takes the question of temporality and when reflection can arise or be manifested into an interesting aspect. Or, yeah.
There's more there.
Yes.
Thank you. I have a question relating to the idea of dance stopping that you exemplified and also discussed. And when you were talking initially about kinesthesia, I was thinking of bodies emerging in being, let's say, immersive experience in space related to movement, immersive experience of movement in interaction, and then an immersive experience of the body in the body, which they're quite interested in virtual reality, for instance. And also from the moments where you go out of virtual reality and the sense of existing for real kind of peels off from the experience, rather being at the core of experience, relating to what you said, Mette, about fetishizing the moment. Maybe the outcomes could be interesting. But I remember, I don't know whether I read this or an anthropologist told me, but in Bali they have this idea that magic always works, except when you think about a white elephant.
Sorry, say that again?
Magic always works, except when you think about a white elephant.
Magic always writes.
Works.
Except when you think about
a white elephant.
White elephant.
About a white elephant.
Right.
We're behind the speakers, that's why it's a bit...
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. That's okay with
Elephant.
me. No problem at all.
Yeah.
So magic always works, except when you think of a white elephant. And that, of course, is a problem of the mind. And then maybe magic only works exceptionally. But then I was thinking maybe the white elephant has something to do with not dancing in a way, that the dancing might somehow resolve the white elephant sometimes. But then you might also have a situation where when the dancing stops, the white elephant is some sort of revelation rather than being an obstruction. So it would be kind of ambiguous in some senses. And that the outcomes of this conundrum might be something interesting to discuss in terms of what is not dance to professionals of movement, which might be a kind of common denominator between you guys. So that's my question.
Shall I say a bit? Yeah, I mean, within the last 10 to 20 years in contemporary dance and choreography, there's been maybe a small division happening between dance and choreography, and it's been coined as extended choreography, so that choreography is more an organizational tool to organize movement in any sort of context and time. And then dance has been freed from choreography, let's say. However, if I can answer what is not dance, I don't know. But just to give some context to the question.
Yeah, hi. My name is Karen Diesen, and I'm a teacher at the Design and the Art and Craft department. And as a practitioner, I find this so interesting. So about time that you were speaking on in the latest of these points, and this to be investigate something. It's another word than research, but that gives a very focus of something that you really want to grasp. But it's more intriguing to be on the way grasping something than had done a grasp, because then you're past the kind of gold moment. Mm-hmm. And if you don't find a new little part or something to improve, then things, the magic disappear as a practitioner. And I wonder whether this can be something to reflect upon of those who's more into the base of practitioner. Mm-hmm.
Can I answer that one? I love that question. I think potentiality has a lot to do with, expectations and time and so on. And for me, just for applying this project, this program, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to be working on something for 3 years, intensively. What would I choose that would be curious to me and that would contain this magic also in 3 years' time, that I won't be working for a year and then discover, oh, I know now the answer, the answer is so and so. It would have to be something that would keep being alluring and mesmerizing to me also in 3 years. So I was thinking very carefully about that before going into and it goes for longer hauls, but I also think for each project maybe one even choose sometimes topics that are kind of unexplainable. I mean, maybe I think all of us, it's like the fact of affect. We know that it exists, but we don't know quite what it contains of, or the riddle in your work. Yeah, and the imagination. It's like there are things that we are dealing with. We're researching on topics that are kind of impossible to really dismantle and say, look, we have now assembled the pieces, it's this, So this potentiality of also of the future thing is always inherent, I feel, in all these projects somehow. And, the beautiful thing about dancing, for instance, is also that the minute it is over, it is gone. It's a major disappearing act, if you like, And I mean, that has always been seen as a problem within dance, but I think it also has become also like a quality of dance, and now people are starting to think of other ways to not document it, but to, we will write some kind of reflection. Yeah, I don't know. There are a lot of things here that are exactly addressing this, what you are dealing with, and you work also as a practitioner, yeah, with your hands. It's still, magic is still present, I guess.
I have a small thought about that, which is I can recognize that, however, in performing, you're also doing the work, so it's not when it's made, it's done. I mean, it's over. That's one moment, and then you have to, it lives with the fact that you're practicing it, doing it. So that's one thing that I also think in relation to the, even the question of research, once I did that piece, when I'm performing it again, in what level, is that then still part of it, or how? And of course, the repetition, the reiteration of doing it, and then each time there's other audiences, which is kind of an important factor in that moment, which is new to the situation. So there's the fact of, I mean, it kind of lives longer than that moment. Then, having said that, from the point of being a practitioner making work, if I would have to choose, I would be doing only that. I mean, it's clear that it's the moment of being in front of the thing that you're searching for is an extremely exciting moment. And then there's different phases of that. You also need the moment of making decisions and then letting go of some things because they are not part of it. And that's, choice starts to be part of it, and the writing starts to take place, and then you move somewhere. I mean, I don't think I couldn't do one without the other, but it's clearly a very exciting moment of the process.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah. Yeah. So is this with the blue? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to listen to you the last couple of hours and also to follow your work. For me as a colleague, I've been following all of your work, because especially Ingrid and Jana Camilla, and I think this question maybe goes especially to you because you have been in the program for the longest time, I guess. I think it's interesting to not think of a division between works and reflection, because from the outside or as a colleague, I feel that your works have been changing a lot because of you being in this program. So thinking also about the work in themselves as the research, and that this program is enabling something that wouldn't be there if you were making them outside of the institution or outside of the program. So I can't like specify it, I just have a sense of it, witnessing it, but I just wondered from your perspective, what do you feel have been changed, or what is possible in the work now that was not possible before, or haven't been possible? Like, what is this program actually doing? Also to think of the artistic research program as something that creates a different art in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, I very much agree with you that this separation between reflection and practice, or the art, object of the art, is can for many people be kind of a construction. And I feel it resonates in me because, as Trond also said, that the attention to detail that you are enabled through the program, and to follow up on those details unfolding and making new choices based on the experience you get all the time, then the reflection, of course, manifests through the art, or it is actually intertwined. It's one and the same in a way. You can speak of it as maybe a refinement, or for some people you can speak of progress maybe, and so on. And I think this is the most important thing about being in the program, this enabling me to really go into detail and see, if I do this, what is the consequence then, and learning from that without kind of having to have a set goal that I need to get there, but to see if I take the consequence of the experience and be kind of thorough in that process, then it will move me somewhere that I wouldn't have gotten to otherwise. And this in my experience is that this has very much happened to my work during my time here, and that it continues. It will continue. It's not for me so much that it will finish in the 3 years, but at 3 years you have a kind of you share with the broader public what has happened, and your experience and your knowledge or attention so far, and then it can continue, of course. So more than this kind of setting out to do something and seeing if it works or not, but being able to have this kind of a refinement is to me very valuable and specific to the program. Yeah.
Yeah, I can only agree to what Jana Camilla says, and this of course has to do with the practical circumstance that you're employed full time and you can commit all your time to working on your project, which is pretty difficult as a freelancer. So that's kind of a major circumstance, of course. And then I think we all agree that it's pretty difficult to produce or to work in artistic processes without any reflection. So for sure, this is inherent to all the artistic work. However, I think reflection within artistic process, that's maybe not always the same as the format you need to find on the reflection in order to disseminate the reflection. And one of the purposes of the program is also to be part of knowledge production within the field and being able to communicate your work to peers. So then that places a slightly different emphasis on the reflection, I think. Or as like you described really well, how it has different roles in different parts of the process. So
yeah, and the sharing part, like you have to communicate it like quite explicitly, or that is a discussion how explicit you have to be, but the notion of actually sharing the experience and the new knowledge or insights is of course specific to the program. And in what way is up to each artist to find the relevant way of this.
I think it's 1 o'clock now. So maybe we can finish here. Thank you very much for your attention. I think you have an extraordinary resource here in these people. And I would suggest ankle tackling, or like just reach, like the cat that paw, like reach to the punch. Get them, just get them if you can. Okay. Thank you.